but let me know if you guys have questions or if you want me to repeat anything. So what we're going to do is add in the animated sprites that we used in our Scratch project. So in Scratch, we used the Piskel program to create the player sprite and the bird sprite. We're going to add those in to our P5 project, so we'll see what that looks like. And one of the things that we want to kind of review and be aware of is how to prepare our image assets or media assets for different environments. So in Scratch, because of the way they draw what they call the costumes, we had to export separate frames for our animation. But in P5, we can actually kind of decide how we want to do it. You could do it as separate frames, and you could use code to change the frames. But what we're going to do is use animated GIFs because it's going to be a little bit easier. We won't have to write as much code. So when we're writing our own code, we have a lot more control over how it works. Whereas when we're using a environment like Scratch, we kind of have to design it the way that it's set up to work by the Scratch developers. You can feel free to change the art here. You don't necessarily have to use the exact same art that you used in the previous version, but I'm just going to use the art that I made for my Scratch project. So I saved that in my Finder in the art folder that I have here. So I'm going to open up Piskel, and I'm going to export these files again in a format that is good for P5. So I'll go to the Piskel website, and I'm going to take my main sprite, which is this one, I think, and replace the animation. And so this is the sprite that I originally created. It has a few different states. It has the sort of idle, which is just this first frame, and then it has these two walk frames, and then it has two eat frames. So we are going to have to modify the animation a little bit in order to make it work correctly as an animated sprite. And we'll see why when we export an animated GIF. So when I go to export and go to GIF, I'm going to download the animated GIF, and then I'll go to the Finder, and I'm just going to make a new little window, and I'm going to go to downloads, and here you can see the animated GIF that I just downloaded. And you can see the issue here is that all of the frames are part of this animation. Or actually, it's only like the last two frames. Or at least when I preview it. It actually looks kind of weird. Let's open it up in Chrome and see if it looks different. Okay. This is what it should look like. I don't know why the preview window is repeating the last two frames. But basically we see all the different parts of the animation, and we don't really want that. And so there's different ways to organize this. In Piskel is not the most sophisticated app, so the easiest thing we're going to do is just delete the frames and then re-import it. So you have to be a little bit careful. You may want to make an extra copy of it or something like that. But what I'm going to do for my idle animation is just delete these extra frames. And then if I want the idle animation maybe to be a little bit more interesting, not just a still image, maybe I'll add a frame, or I'll duplicate this frame. And let's fill in, let's just make the eyes kind of moving around a little bit, just to give some indication that the character is doing something. So we'll just have him look over to the side a little bit. And then I'm just going to duplicate a few of the first frames so it doesn't happen all the time. So we just get a pretty basic animation here for our idle animation. I'm not going to bother saving this as a separate Piskel file, but you could if you want to. So now I'll export this again. And so I'm going to download it as an animated GIF. And when I go to the Finder, you can see here's this new animated GIF that is just the idle animation. So I'm going to change the name of this file to character_idle. So when I add it into P5, I'll know what it's for. And then I'm just going to basically start over. So I'll move this over here, and I'll find my main sprite again and just replace that. And so now I just want the walk animation. So I'm just going to accidentally duplicate it, but I want to delete these extra frames until I just have the walk animation. And now I'm going to export the walk. So I'm just going to do the same thing. Just download it. And I'm exporting them at a 2x scale. So they all need to be the same scale for this to look right. Here's my new walk animated GIF. So I'm just going to rename this character walk. And then I have one more animation. So I could probably just actually Command Z and undo and then grab these frames. There's my eat animation. So I'll export this. Same exact process. I'm just going to download this animated GIF. Hey, how's it going? And we're going to rename this one character eat. Okay, so we've got 3 separate animated GIFs. And so we can play different animated GIFs in our character depending on which animation we want to see. That's the main difference between how we're going to do it with P5 and with Scratch. As I mentioned, there's a lot of different ways you could do it. I think this is going to be sort of the most straightforward way from a programming point of view. But you could do it in a lot of different ways. You could have it all just be P5 graphics and just program it that way. But I think this will be a good way to kind of show how this is going to work. We're still going to have to use, just like we did in Scratch, we had to use this animation state variable. And so we're still going to use that in P5, so it's going to work very much the same way. But it will be working inside P5 rather than Scratch. So that's what we're going to work on while we upload our images, is playing different images based on different animation states. Okay, so now we're back in P5. First thing we have to do is upload our images. So to upload an image in P5, you can just go over to this window here to our sketch files, and you can either click this plus button to upload a file, or what I want to do is organize my project a little more. So I'm going to create a folder. You might not want to do that. It's kind of up to you how you organize it. I like to have things nice and organized. So I'm going to create a folder, and I'm going to call this sprites. And I'm going to save all of my image files in here. So then if I want an image to go into the folder, instead of clicking the main plus button, I have to go to this sprites folder and then click on this drop down and then upload a file here. And with the P5 browser, the file browser, it's not like the most fully featured file browser. So sometimes you might make mistakes and you might not be able to move your files around. If you add a file here, I don't know if it's really that easy to move it to a different folder. So, if you do, it's not the end of the world, but you may not be able to get out of there. I can't get rid of this modal, so let's just do that. Okay, let's upload some files. So I'm going to click here, and I'm going to upload these animated GIF files. And they're all pretty small. You can see each one is like 5 kilobytes, 8 kilobytes. It should be relatively small. If your image size is like over a megabyte, that's way too big. If it's like 500 kilobytes, that's probably too big, depending on what it's being used for. If it's like a background, it could be a little bit bigger. But for these sprites, the file size should be pretty small. All right, so we've got some files we can work with now. I'm going to close this file browser. Actually, I'm going to leave it open for a second while we add the code in. So I'm just going to put my text editor over here a little bit. Let's update some of the comments in our sketch because we're doing something different here. So I'm going to say adding animation to character. And this today is the 11th. And I'm going to get rid of some of the previous comments that I had, just because I don't necessarily need them anymore. Okay. Okay, so now we're going to look at how to load the image. So in P5, we actually have to load the image into memory. And there's a separate function that we use for this. So if we look at the reference, we can find this under image, I think, or maybe media. Let's see. They redid the reference, so I'm not as familiar with where everything is. But let's see if we can find the image section. Okay. So we see here the image section. So displaying an image just uses the image function like you would like an ellipse or a rectangle. Load image is what loads images. The thing that it doesn't mention here is something that we need to do to load our images before we try to use them. Let's see if we can find where that is. It may not be. Let's look for it here. So we need to use a function called preload. The preload function is used to load all of our assets before we try to draw them. If you try to draw an image that you haven't loaded into memory, you're either not going to see the image or you might get an error. So we want to avoid that, and we can do that using preload. So preload is going to load all of the files that we want to use in our game before the actual graphics starts. So it actually happens before setup and before draw. And like setup, it only runs once. So we need to use our function preload. And one thing that we have to be careful about is we have to use global variables for our images because we need the images to be accessible to both the preload function when we want to load them and the draw function when we want to draw them. So just like X and Y, we need global variables for our images that are accessible to preload and draw. So I'll put a note here. So I'll say global variables to contain image data accessed by preload and draw. Okay, so preload loads external media files, runs once before setup is called. So this is a very common way for any type of programming environment or media environment to be organized, where we want to preload any sounds or images or other large files before we try to draw them or try to use them in our program. Anytime if you see a loading screen in a game where there's like a little spinning circle or a loading bar, that's what it's doing. It's loading all the files that make up the graphics or other media for the game. So we need some variables for each one of these animations. Again, there's different ways to do this, but I'm just going to do it in a relatively simple way. I'm going to declare the variables using let, but I'm going to put them all in one line. This is something that we haven't done before, but one way to make this a little bit shorter rather than doing 3 different lines of let for each variable. If we're just declaring the variables, we can separate them by commas, so we can save a little bit of space. So I'm going to name these character idle sprite. That's the first image. I might shorten this a little bit to just char idle sprite, just so it doesn't take up quite as much space. And then char walk sprite and char eat sprite. So with this method, we need a variable for each animation that we want to display. And then in preload, we're going to load each one of our images from our file system. So we're going to start with char idle sprite. So notice when I declare a variable, again, I have to use let. So I make that variable in memory. But when I actually use the variable, I don't use let. That will overwrite the reference that I previously created. So char idle sprite equals load image. And here I need to reference the image source in the file system just like I would in HTML. So I need to use the name of the folder first, sprites, and then a slash to indicate a folder, and then the file name for the sprite that I want to load. So this one is character_idle.gif, and then I'm just going to put a semicolon there. And I'm just going to copy and paste this a couple times so that I don't have to rewrite the whole thing, because I'm going to do this 2 more times with the different sprites. So I have my idle sprite loads in the idle GIF. Then I'm just going to copy and replace this guy. Walk sprite loads the walk GIF. And then the eat sprite loads the eat GIF. And however many animations you want to be in your game, you're going to have to load here. If you have like a lot of animations, we could talk about more efficient ways to load them. Things that we haven't quite learned yet, but we will learn probably next week. Okay, so we've got our animations. Let's add them to our character. So I'm gonna close the sketch files for now. Yeah.
So like, you're not gonna use the character you've drawn, you're gonna use the sprites instead.
Yeah. Yeah. You can keep using the P5 graphics if you want, but I think managing the different animations is going to be easier with the animation files. And I also want to, part of it is just a lesson about how to load the images.
Because you like bunch them together instead of like individual steps, right, for the animation. So.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Okay. So we've loaded our images. So let's go draw them. So right now, when we draw the character, we're like doing all this P5 stuff. So we're gonna get rid of this for now. That's another reason why you should make copies. So at the beginning, remember I duplicated this before I started making changes. Make sure to do that because you don't wanna lose all that code that you wrote. You may decide that you wanna use it later for something. So before you overwrite a bunch of code or delete a bunch of code, make sure that you're working on a new file. Make sure to duplicate the file. So I'm just gonna delete the character code. And for now, I'm just going to draw an image at XY. The image. So the first image I'm going to draw is just the idle image. So to draw an image, we just take the variable that we loaded the image data into. And that's the first parameter in our image function. And then the rest of the image function works just like rectangle or circle. It's just X, Y, and then width and height. So I'm going to say draw the image here. So we're going to have char idle sprite at X, Y. Okay, so now you can see we've got the idle sprite. And the code still works just the same because we're drawing it at the X, Y that we created to move our previous drawing. So this obviously takes up a lot less space because we've done all the work of drawing the graphics in a different program. Now we're just loading it in here. But again, if you want to use the P5, you could do that. You would just maybe need to organize things differently. We could go over different ways to do that. But now what we want to do is also draw the walk sprite. So here's where we want to start to use our animation states. So we're going to create an animation state variable. So I'll do that up here next to my XY variables. I'll say let animation state equals 0. And again, remember in Scratch, the way that we use this is we can see if we look at our player sprite, we had an animation state variable. And what we did is that allows us to separate the graphics from the movement. So we have one block that changes the animation. So if the animation is 0, we change to idle, et cetera, et cetera. If it's 1, we walk. If it's 2, we do eat. And then separate from that, we have our movement block over here, which sets the animation state based on different movements. So that means that our motion and our animation are not directly tied to each other, and that is going to allow us to add extra states like eating the birds later on. So I'm going to put a note here that 0 is idle, 1 is walk, and 2 is eat. We're not going to add the eat until later in class. Okay, so this is one of our player variables. I'll I'll just put a note here. This keeps track, keeps track of animation. Okay, and this is going to get a little more complex in the second lesson today, but for now it's pretty simple. Basically, what we want to do is at the very beginning of our draw function, we want to assume that the animation state is 0. So assume player is idle. And then if the player is moving, then we know that the player is walking. So we'll say if the key is down, right arrow, animation state equals 1. And the exact same thing happens if the key is down, left arrow. Because my walk animation is the same left or right, if you want to add a right and left walk animation that are different, then you would add more animation states. So this is a walk animation. Okay, I'm gonna tidy this because I think I got the formatting off. There we go. Okay, so now we use control flow to decide which animation to draw. This is another thing that's good because we can separate, by separating our key is down key presses from our animation, we can use a different block to do the animation, and we can use if and else if, which we want to do for the animation because we don't want to try to draw 2 frames at the same time. But with our movement, we do want to just use a series of if statements because the movements will cancel each other out. So it depends on the context. This isn't always the case, but often, often it will be the case that you want to use different control blocks for movement and animation. Okay, so let's comment this out. So now let's do our animation block. So we're going to say if animation state equals 0. And you want to use either double or you can actually use triple equal signs here if you want to in JavaScript. Either one is fine. Remember, the double equal sign is basically saying that these 2 values are the same. This is different than the single equal sign, which is saying we're assigning a value to a variable. So that's a common mistake to make, especially because if I use a single equal sign here, JavaScript will actually just run that and it'll assign 0 to the animation state. It won't give me an error there. So your code will not work the way that you want it to, but you won't know. So I'll put a note here, double equal sign is for conditional statements. So last week we used the key is down conditional, and this tells us if we have a right or a left arrow press. This is the same thing. This is a conditional inside the if statement, but we're comparing 2 values. So we're checking to see if animation state is the same as 0. And it will be if we're not pressing a key because we assume it's idle at the beginning of the program. So this is kind of the same thing that's happening with our if blocks here with the green if key right arrow pressed versus our animation state block where we have animation state equals 2. In Scratch, they use a single equal sign here, which is super confusing. But in most programming languages, including JavaScript, we use a double or triple equal sign for evaluating a condition. There is a difference between the two, but we don't really need to talk about what it is right now. Okay, so if the animation state is 0, then we still want to draw our idle sprite. Here's where we want to use an else. So just like in Scratch where we have if and then if else, we have that in JavaScript. Excuse me. If this isn't the case, then we can evaluate another possibility. So we can say else and then if animation state equals 1, then we're doing basically the exact same code, but we're changing this to the walk sprite. And the thing that's going to give us, hey, how's it going? The thing that's nice about writing this in JavaScript is we can easily add as many blocks as we want to, or as many if and else if. So in Scratch, one of the limitations is you just have if and else, which is why you end up with these goofy looking blocks where we have if not, if da-da-da, if. In JavaScript, we can add as many of these blocks as we want. So we can have as many animations as we want more easily. Okay, so now if I walk, I get this little walk animation. It doesn't really match the speed of the character, so let's fix that in a second. But mainly the point is that now when I'm idle, my character does the idle animation, and when I walk, it walks. We'll add a little bit more later. For now, just to fix that. So if you see the walk animation doesn't quite match the speed, you could change the speed of the animation here, or the movement rather, by changing 5. So if it's really slow, maybe we change this to like 2. Or we could speed up the animation in Piskel. So let's do that as well, just so we can see what that would look like. So in Piskel, I got rid of my walk animation. So I'm just going to create a new sprite. Let's imagine that I forgot my, I lost my walk file. I can just import this animated GIF here. And oh, maybe it won't actually. Hold on, maybe I'm thinking of a sprite sheet. Actually, I'm not sure if this will work. Let's see if it works. So let's say import a single image. Okay, so it does work. So the reason I did it that way is there's 2 things I want to go over. So 1, we can change the frames per second. You can see it's much faster now. But 2 is notice that the size is different. So we imported one that I had exported at 2x. So when we export this, we don't want to export at 2x because it's going to be twice as big as that. So we're going to want to go down to 1x. So just, however you do it, just make sure that you're exporting at the right scale when you do it. So 12 frames per second is probably a little too fast. Let's do like 8 frames per second. And that'll go, the animated GIF will react to that change. So let's download this and let's go back to our Finder. I'm still in the downloads folder. I have to remember to throw all this stuff in my art folder before I finish. But so now notice the difference between the 2 animations. One has the 8 frames per second and this has the 12 frames per second. So let's delete the previous one and name that just the regular walk. But now we have to replace that file in P5. So if you make a change to the file, we have to go back to P5 and go back to our sketch files. And what I want to do is just delete this one first, and then upload the new one to the folder. So I want to click on the folder, click this drop down, upload a file, and then upload our new file. Okay, so if you use the same name, then it should work. So let's try that now. Okay, so now I have a faster animation that more closely matches the speed of the character. Okay, so I'm gonna stop here and save this. And so if we can have some classwork time, you guys can work on adding the animated GIF. In the second part of class, we'll add in the bird and create some objects so we can start spawning our bird sprite into the game. Okay, so I'm gonna save this. I'll put a link to this on the class notes, and I'll add this to our class collection. And yeah, so I'm gonna stop the video before I do that.